Good morning, everyone, and welcome to First Draft, where I speak with journalists about their important work and the stories behind them. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. Well, Donald Trump is clearly terrified about Republicans losing the midterm elections because a Democratic Congress would mean some much needed accountability for his administration. Usually, when politicians want to win elections, they focus on messaging, policy, and maybe working to improve people's lives. However, Donald Trump seems to have taken a very different tack. As we've seen through countless attempts that are being made wide out in the open to suppress the vote, from his gerrymandering push in several states starting last year to his obsession with getting the Save America passed in the Senate. And it looks like tomorrow night he'll be giving a primetime address laying out lies about interference in previous elections and paving the way to meddle in the upcoming election this November. Angelo Carusone is the president of Media Matters of America, and he and his team have been tracking some of this in the MAGA media sphere, and he joins us to talk about this and much more. Angelo, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, before we jump into some of Media Matters reporting, I wanted to talk with you about the passing of South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican. You and your team at Media Matters have tracked a number of popular right-wing figures over the years. What stands out to you about your work on Senator Graham throughout all these years, dating back to the Benghazi hearings, the Kavanaugh hearings, and of course, his obsession with bombing Iran?
Yeah, I think a few things. One, he was often treated by the media broadly as a validator for some pretty extreme right-wing positions. I mean, he was in some ways a sort of a conduit for some extreme sort of on international policy, hawkish positions that would sort of get pushed into the mainstream. And because he said it, as opposed to some podcaster or far-right radio host, it had a lot more weight to it in the larger national discussion. So that's one piece. The second thing that really sticks out at me, though, and it's a pattern that played out consistently throughout his career that the media never fully latched onto in terms of contextualizing his role or why he moved back and forth, is that he really sort of suffered from sort of the ultimate sidekick syndrome.
Yeah.
And that he was always trying to latch himself onto, what was sort of this machismo masculine figure, main character in the storyline, whether it's McCain or Trump. And that to me is one of the components of it, is that the rest of the media let him play that role repeatedly over and over and over again. And it mattered because the two things tie together. It meant that he could then use the position that he had, that veneer of gravity or respectability, to then advance or advocate for positions of these people that he was, sort of pushing like Trump, and get away with it without, and help it have material effect in the larger conversation. So those are the two things that stuck out, is that there was never a hawkish position that far right, at the time, right, talk radio hosts, now it's podcasters, that were advocating for, that he did not take up the mantle of and try to put the Senate's imprimatur on it.
That's a really interesting perspective to have. And I know he's had so many, memorable moments, him screaming at the Kavanaugh hearing, really playing defense for Donald Trump on that one. And of course, he was at the center of the effort to bloody up Hillary Clinton over the Benghazi, controversy during her time as Secretary of State that really impacted her presidential campaign. He was really good at getting on TV. He was one of those senators who, lived on Meet the Press. And I think he was actually getting ready to go back on one of the Sunday shows when he fell ill and actually died. Can you talk about, how he was able to kind of craft that persona, and why he became one of those go-to figures for the mainstream press?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting parts about him, and there are a few figures that do it, but not many. And I think that it's something that the media sort of played along with. That's why I'm a critic of how they dealt with him, is that he really positioned himself, like I said, the sidekick thing is not just a cheap jab. It's that he sort of latched, he has a sort of parasocial, parapolitical relationship with main figures. He was never the main character. He was never the primary driver. What he was always doing was carrying water for or advancing somebody else's position, at least as it relates to the narrative of the story. And that's how the tie-in with these Sunday shows comes into perspective, because it would allow him to go on these shows, which were for a long period of time were real principal newsmakers. They were news drivers,
right?
And sort of stake out terrain and shift the conversation of coverage for the following week. And the vehicle that he used to sort of do that, aside from his accessibility and willingness to engage with reporters, is that he maintained an element of surprise. So what he would do sometimes is not just pay lip service to bipartisanship or even his job, which is being sort of a judicious, thoughtful legislator and hearing committee person, is that he would take positions that people would say, oh, that's contrary to what we expect. Right? Look at this. Look at the terrain he's staking out. He said some of the most aggressive things about Trump in those early days.
Oh, yeah.
And it was partly, I think, what he thought, but also he understood that it was going to help him get media attention. Because he was staking out a part of the story that needed to be told but didn't have a storyteller. And that's ultimately the key to the question you asked, which is that what he understood is what the larger national conversation, where it was going, the types of stories that were going to be told one way or another, and where there was a gap, where there was an absent principal figure, key figure, that could fill that role and then get the attention, the quotes, the bookings. And he positioned himself repeatedly to step into that role. And to just put a bow on it, it really ties in with, just to show how savvy that is. It's not an accident. Even in his own biography, when he talked about his sort of war and service history, he describes himself as a veteran of conflict, and everyone disagreed with that. But he understood that in the early days, as he was growing his political campaign, that just because he was serving in the military, that doesn't mean you get to call yourself an active war veteran. But he did, because there were conflicts happening at the time. And yet he made that a piece of his narrative and really emphasized it, because he understood that how the media would react to that it would position him to have more credibility on certain topics, especially hawkishness. Got a lot of blowback in those early days. It seems quaint now, given all the scandals we deal with. But that was sort of the beginning stages of him developing the muscle memory of becoming the storyteller that, by the time of Trump's first term, he was so sort of exercised in being.
Yeah. So one thing that I think is interesting is that a lot of people in MAGA, younger politicians than Lindsey Graham, they spend all their time in the right-wing media bubble, and they just want a message to their people. And most of them are in safe red districts, and they can do that. Some of them have their own podcasts, like Ted Cruz. I mean, he seems far happier doing that than actually being a senator. Is there still a valuable role for someone like Lindsey Graham to continue to be that figure that's accessible to the mainstream media, and to build his credibility in that way, and to sell some really extremist positions? Is that still valued, or now that that makes you suspicious with the MAGA base? Are we going to see that he's kind of the last of an era?
The function still plays out. It's important. The gatekeepers, or the people you talk to, will need to be revised. If somebody tries to build a similar type of footprint in national politics by just using traditional media, the Sunday shows, they're not going to be able to exercise that power, because they just don't have the penetration that's required. The landscape is so atomized. There's so many different storytellers. But the impulse, the intention is actually very significant, because there are a host of figures that will go to, not politics first types of personalities, podcasters, the MAHA space I would not consider to be politics first, but it's going to be deeply important in our political landscape going forward. It's one of the big durable parts of what the MAGA, the last MAGA coalition, people who can go in those spaces and sort of connect, build a bridge to that audience, it gives them a chance then to push some other more extreme ideas or paper over some things that otherwise seem totally unacceptable or extreme. And that is going to be a key part of it. People that can exist in multiple parts of this online hyper-fragmented landscape are going to be able to build and organize and push power way more effectively than those that don't. And in a way, what he did was an analog version of what is now going to be, a much more digital version. And that's the key difference maker. And he's not the only one that did it. I think a lot of it was born out of, like I said, the Sidekick syndrome. I really didn't say it just to make a jab. I think it is a big part of his bio and who and how he positioned himself, because that was a key part of that people wanted to talk to him. If you can't get to the boss or the principal or the main figure, you can sort of speak to a proxy, which helps you drive news. And that was a key part of his proximity. And I think that's the big reveal in all of this. And I think that's the one difference maker between the new media and the old media, is that he was so vigorous and vicious in his critiques of Trump. But when the time came, multiple times, including after January 6th, but every time the question was asked, he always chose proximity over principle, over the principle that he stated. And in an online landscape, he can get away with that with gatekeepers. The hosts of these shows will forgive and forget, right? Because they think about a larger arc. Online programs that have a different relationship with their audiences don't get the same luxury. They'll get more rewards by punishing him or figures that are as blatantly hypocritical or as abandoned than by just trying to be a participant and an enabler. And I think that's one of the differences between audiences of the more traditional media and the new media, is that the audiences in the new media expect something different. They expect to have much more of a say, and their tolerance for some of that is actually lower across the board.
So, he did this tremendous heel turn, after fighting with Trump during the 2016 election, became one of his most dedicated lieutenants. I think, nobody has played more rounds of golf, in the Senate than Lindsey Graham has. And he was a big part of Trump's push to try and overturn the results in the Georgia 2020 election, one of the key states that Trump lost. He was pressuring the Secretary of State, to find the votes for Donald Trump. And so now, what we're hearing is that this will be the focus of what Donald Trump will be speaking to the nation about tomorrow night. Yeah. And I know that Media Matters did a really fascinating piece on Steve Bannon, who has been kind of, ramping up the war room for what this assault on our November election could look like. I think we have a clip of that. But we've heard all these claims before, but let's play them right now.
But the Save America Act is a big issue about, even if passed with the court challenges, etc., would you be able to implement it between now and Election Day? That's why people are talking about this national security emergency, of which you would have an executive order, and it'd be based upon a predicate of actually finding information, finding evidence that there was foreign interference, let's say this, foreign interference in the 2020 election. And my understanding, and I have not seen the classified information, but my understanding is that there's information coming out about Venezuela, and there's information coming out about China. Now, when is that going to be presented? Is it next week or the week after, or maybe the week after that? I don't know, but I know people are working on
it. So can you break down for people who don't have to spend their lives listening to Steve Bannon, the fortunate people, what is he getting at here? What can we expect?
So there is and it's in play right now. And I would just note that what we can expect on Thursday is sort of the premiere of what is about to become this cycle that I'm going to describe. And it sort of has three parts. And what Bannon was sort of dancing around the edges on there, but eventually ultimately validated, is one, manufacture a predicate. So you do something, you say something, you make it clear there's a predicate. There's some massive crisis that then requires step two. Declare a national emergency. And then with that national emergency, step three, impose by decree, by executive action, as many or more of the SAVE Act components as you possibly can, as well as take other ancillary actions that can interfere with, disrupt, undermine the midterm elections. That is it in a nutshell. And it's a lot more than just podcast talk, just bluster. It's now becoming policy. And there were signs along the way that this was happening. And one of the harbingers was a few months ago, there was some chatter, and then it became more serious, and then he was vetted, a guy by the name of John Solomon, who is now running a White House task force specifically focused on declassifying documents.
Doesn't he run the Hill? The publication, The Hill?
He used to be at The Hill, yeah. Now he works at another outlet, an online outlet, but he's now officially a member of the White House.
Just the news?
Just the news, yeah.
Because you see Trump tweets that their news all the time.
That's right. And he has been sort of a launderer of what we call the Trump cycle, which is sort of take this sort of piece of nonsense or information, you push it out through what looks like a report, and John Solomon was a vehicle for that. The right-wing media goes absolutely apoplectic over it. It creates a massive scandal that requires some type of action, and then an action is taken. And this has played out in the past, a very similar model, by the way. Back in 2020, there was a bunch of stuff pushed out and declassified by the DNI at the time, who was Richard Grenell, who's another sort of political crony similar to what we have in place right now. Pushed out some demasked or pushed out these Michael Flynn lists and demasked a bunch of figures. The idea was that there was this massive flood of investigations for Trump's people, and that's going to be one of the things that we have to look into. It created such a firestorm. I know Bill Barr gets held up in esteem for some of the stuff that he did. People say, oh, look at him. Even Bill Barr said there was nothing. And yeah, that's true. At the end of the day, Bill Barr was a safeguard in some way. But Bill Barr appointed a special prosecutor to investigate those nonsense claims.
Right.
They didn't pan out. And I think one of the but it's the same playbook that they're running now. A similarly positioned DNI, Bill Pulte, who's basically a political operative, who's an acting DNI right now, is using that power to essentially seek out and declassify and push out documents and content about stories, like you said, has already been rehashed multiple times, but it is to try to sensationalize it in a way to make it seem significant and new, so that you can then begin to create the feeding frenzy, the predicate for what is the next step, the national emergency.
Right. And it seems like this is a playbook that we've seen over and over again in terms of how they're able to launder these kinds of conspiracy theories and, trumped up, ridiculousness into the mainstream media, because it creates this online firestorm in right-wing media. And then, mainstream outlets can't help but touch it. And even if they're debunking it, a lot of times they're reinforcing, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. There's something here. And to me, this is something that the right wing has been just so incredibly effective at doing.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is different this time than last time, that especially as it relates to the mainstream media component, the legacy media, is that the last time around, there were still all parts of the government, many parts were still functioning in some way. And as we've seen time and again, he's so aggressively hollowed out the institutions. One of the things I heard when Trump got reelected this time is everybody was sort of reinforcing this idea that there's no more adults in the room, right? It's all these cronies. And in particular, as it relates to this, it's worth noting that they fired hundreds of people in the CISA, which is an agency that's partly an agency that's responsible for protecting elections. One of the bodies that helps certify or legitimize voting machines as not being, as being sound. He just last week fired all the remaining people on the Democrats. They shut down the interagency for protecting elections this cycle. Bill Pulte, one of the first things that he did was fire a bunch of intelligence analysts. So my point in all of that is that all the people internally that could say or legitimize, hey, whoa. It actually wasn't stolen. None of this stuff happened. They've been wiped out. And that's what news media relies on, right? That's what happened the first time around, is that there was reporting from Trump's own intelligence community that was saying, these claims are actually not true, right? there was no manipulation. No, there was no stealing. There may have been some vulnerabilities, but there was no actual consequences. There was no actual attempt. This didn't happen. All those mechanisms that news media would rely on to not just debunk, but to recalibrate how they talk about this story, they're gone. They don't exist anymore in our government. And I think that's one of the tells as to how far they're willing to go here. And all that means on our end is that we all have to think more about the types of antibodies that we put into the system of storytelling so that their narrative doesn't become so confusing and chaotic that it ultimately results in polluting the entire system.
Yeah, I know that Sophie Lawton, one of your researchers at Media Matters, did some really good reporting about how an election denier close to Donald Trump was one of the people behind this decision to fire the members of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Can you talk with us about what some of that reporting showed about how this all went down? Because this was one of those like Friday night massacre situations. And I didn't think that this commission was necessarily on people's radar.
So, yes, a couple of things here. One, I just want to start with a silly example to reinforce this real example. And if you recall, there was a couple months ago, Trump put ICE agents into airports. And the genesis of that was exactly the mechanism that I'm going to describe here. There was a caller to a prominent right-wing radio show, Clay and Buck. The caller, Linda from Arizona, proposed it. The host of the show thought it was such a great idea that they went on Fox News. Again, similar situation here over the weekend, and they proposed it. And Trump, within a few hours after the segment, ordered exactly that.
So we basically have the White House being run by the comments section, literally.
That's right. And in this case, one of the things, and so it's similar. So I point that out because it's a recent one. It's concrete. One of the things that happened here is another example. This guy who's, again, like has been noted, was a prominent election denier. His name is David Clements. He was going on one of these podcasts that has relationships to Trump because he's so tied into this machinery, and basically made this point and said, this is the thing that you have to target, this particular agency, this component. And if you think about it, what I just described is a part of what they do. The other thing that they do is they work with states and local offices to help them respond to the Help America Vote Act. It's a commission that was created by Congress, and it's designed to basically say, we're a local municipality. We're having trouble with getting this type of accessibility. We need this amount of machines. They're a facilitator of functioning elections, and they help make sure the machinery works in some ways. There's no federal oversight of it, but they're a vehicle to help make sure more people vote. That's as basic as it is. It's not that big of an agency, but he zeroed in on it, like a lot of these sort of conservative conspiracists do, as sort of the hub, one of the key parts of all of this. And it similar pathway made its way into Trump's orbit. And one of the things to consider is that the relationship between the administration officials and these right-wing media fever swamps is incredibly synergistic and tied in. So, for example, in 2020, the Department of Homeland Security official who said, no, we can't seize the voting machines, was Ken Cuccinelli, a former Republican elected official. The person that has that job at the Department of Homeland Security now is a woman by the name of Heather Honey, who in 2020 was a similarly positioned election denier, prominent online presence. And that is, the FBI director was a former podcast host. Like, there's just so much of a revolving door between the right-wing media fever swamps and now administration officials, that when you have this example that you pointed to, this David Clements example with this election commission, you can get out there, you can plant your flag in the right-wing media, and there's so many pieces of connective tissue that it's almost as good as having it right in the president's daily briefing. In some ways faster, as we've seen, because it makes its way to action like that.
Yeah. So we've seen this multi-prong attack on the November election, and in so many different ways, from Trump's gerrymandering push in Republican states, the Supreme Court's Calais decision, which just turbocharged gerrymandering, especially in Republican southern states, going after the power of Black voters. And, obviously Trump has been obsessed with the Save America Act. Even though he has not been successful yet at the executive level, he's tried to implement as much of that law as he can. He's going after mail-in voting with the USPS. And then, probably to me, the absolute most concerning prospect is ICE and federal agents at the polls, not just intimidating people, but taking ballot boxes. And in my state of Michigan, where there is no, paper trail, if they take the boxes, that will throw the election into chaos. You will not know who won. And that is the case in a lot of elections, because it's supposed to be decentralized process so that it can't be hijacked. And the idea of having federal goons do this, is something that obviously none of us expected. But here we are with the Trump administration. They already have, exhibited such extreme federal overreach in terms of ICE and in so many different ways. What do we do concretely to prepare for this and to fight back?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that I would say is that we have to gird ourselves for a longer fight.
Okay.
The election is not the end, not the finish line. It's sort of the end of the first act. And as you noted, part of his fixation on the Save America Act has been it's sort of win-win from his perspective. He realizes he can't get the voters anymore, right? It's still deeply unpopular. He's coming out of some position of weakness. He's so deeply unpopular. Not going to get the voters. He's not going to win in terms of raw numbers. But so you go after the votes in some way, right? You go after the actual machinery of the votes. Mm-hmm. And either you do it through the types of things you described, in which case you're able to achieve an outcome, or if you don't and you're not successful, immediately after you say the entire election was stolen. And you perpetuate the attacks on these civic institutions. And so I start there with what we need to do, which is that we need to gird ourselves for a longer fight. And I always think about something Steve Bannon said, it sticks into my mind. He was talking with PBS and explaining why he was confident that they would ultimately prevail. And his point was that you all don't have the stomach for this. You'll quit, and we won't. And in a way, he's right that they are ready for the long haul. So one is to recognize that the entities so far in the institutions, Trump is losing in courts, right? And this new chaotic strategy, they've run this playbook before, and it has been a total bust. And they have tried to go after their opponents, and it has not been working. I mean, the process is the punishment. We shouldn't diminish how damaging that is, but they keep losing every time they are pressed, and they'll come back, but they keep losing. So one, that's the first piece. The second piece is we need to really inoculate as much as we can when it comes to what their playbook is, because it undermines the power of it. One of the strategies of flooding the zone is to make it seem like it's an open question, or create so much confusion and doubt that in that doubt, the inertia wins, and the inertia is going to be on their side and allows them to do all kinds of things. We have to eliminate that, which is why we should be talking about not just how nonsensical it is, but sort of laying out the so what of him getting out there and spouting these lies, because that will make a difference for all of us. And that's the second piece. The third is we need to make sure that all the players that are fighting these things are fully prepared to do so. And that is, like the courts, all the entities that deal with these legal battles, that's going to be a huge part of this. There's going to be a ton of litigation. And the last piece is the sensitivity to the early warning. One thing that is particularly unique here, aside from all the stuff that we were talking about, this Bannon, this Pulte stuff, is that we saw this in Minnesota, which was one of the playbooks, where this guy Nick Shirley went out and did this viral video about voting, about all these about the Somali population fraud, right? Yeah, about Somali fraud, but it went viral, and what it did is create the pretext for a massive amount of crackdown on Minnesota. Right. That playbook, he's not the only one of these investigative influencers. There's several of them that have sort of been fanning out across the country that are going to do similar types of hit videos as we get closer to voting, to create oh, look at all this stolen. And that gets into your point about, wait, the fear of, say, a bunch of ballot boxes or a bunch of polling stations being attacked by ICE, because you just need one of those videos to go truly viral to create enough confusion in the minds of many to justify the types of actions that you've described. We can get in front of that. We just need to be particularly aware of that signal. So it's an all, it's a multi-pronged strategy. I think the most important thing, though, is it's not a sprint, and we all just need to be prepared for a longer fight. That's what I would say.
And of course, we have a dress rehearsal with the 2020 election. And, I was reporting on that election here in Michigan, where there were all the conspiracies about votes being carried in suitcases out of Cobo Hall in Detroit, and them trying to blame, some sort of nefarious conspiracy here and elsewhere. And so we know what the playbook is, and at least that is a guide for us. But that did kind of set a chill through my spine, that where you were talking about Steve Bannon saying you don't have the stomach for this, because this is a battle that they have been fighting nonstop since Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. He never gave up. He was charged with felony after felony, and he was facing possible prison time, and so many of his associates, Mike Flynn on down, and they've never given up the ghost. I mean, here he is, set to go on national television tomorrow night to relitigate the election he lost again as a pretext to trying to prevent Democrats from checking his power during this election. And so, that's always been what Republicans have counted on, and certainly MAGA has, that people will just say this is too hard. And even though they're in the minority, they want it more. And, unfortunately, the battle to save our democracy is long and hard, and we have to gird ourselves for this. And I think that's a really, really important point that you make.
I really believe that.
And let's talk just before we move on, let's talk a little more about Steve Bannon himself, because he's had a much lower profile. I mean, certainly not in like MAGA media circles, but he was literally in the White House during Trump's first term as a senior advisor. He's been on the outs. He's come back in. He, had his own legal woes that kind of felled him for a while. But how influential is he these days? How much of a direct line does he have to the White House? And is he kind of like the godfather of all of these little podcasters and media influencers in MAGA?
It's that's the right question. It's a question we ask ourselves all the time, which is who matters and when do they matter? Mm-hmm. And what's different now in this moment compared to 15, 20 years ago is that it was always, who mattered was static. Rush Limbaugh always mattered.
Right.
Right. I mean, and that was it. You didn't have to ask yourself that question every day. That's not the case anymore. Who matters and when they matter changes quite a bit. Mm. And when one of the things about Bannon, both during the 2024 election and then in the first few months of 25 of Trump's second term, he mattered a lot. And the reason why he mattered wasn't because of the size of his audience. It's because, as I noted before, so many of these figures have been spanned out into parts of the into parts of the administration. Bannon was sort of using his show as a launch pad. We shouldn't forget that Scott Bessent, right, is a Bannon guy, as one example. I mean, a lot of the people that staff key roles Bannon had been pushing during the election, and then during that time period, when the appointments were happening, he was super important. What grounded him wasn't just his connection to all of these figures, but that he had a worldview. He had the clearest, most cohesive story. Because remember, the MAGA coalition, is sort of a group built on grift and grievance, racial grievance and personal grievance and political grievance, but it's grievance and grift. And Trump sits atop it, but it's hard for them to tell a cohesive story. And Bannon did have a worldview. He sort of frames it in these epic battles. Then he stopped mattering a lot, and one of the mechanisms for that was Epstein. There was so much content around Epstein and his relationship with him, and all those videos. He had 6 hours of footage that he didn't release, and it just sort of pushed him further to the edges. And he never really got his footing back for quite some time until recently. And I would say that he matters quite a bit now. He was the one. We shouldn't forget that Bill Pulte is the acting DNI right now, because the person that could have been confirmed, Jay Clayton, the actual nominee to fill the role, who would actually pass confirmation, one of the things that Bannon had been pushing for was Trump to withhold back on him going to hearings so that he could get an acting to execute this strategy. Right. And so I would say that what he provides right now is an overarching narrative and a sense of the horizon that they're getting toward. And a lot of the figures that are now being featured prominently, like John Solomon, were just like Scott Bessent before him, were very active parts of Bannon's community before he got into this task force role. So I think his influence had waned quite a bit. I would say right now it's right back at the top. How much he directly talks to Trump, I think, is pretty limited. Well, you can never tell. But how much, he's either the greatest guesser in the world or he has some relationship there, because time and again in the last 6-7 weeks, his predictions about what's to happen have come true. 10 or so days ago, Steve Bannon predicted this very Thursday and said, we're about to see some documents being released and some big announcements, and here you go. So I would say that his influence is probably back in a big way right now, in part because of who he spawned, and in part because he has the most cohesive story about how to get to election day on the back of this particular attack.
Interesting. One of the ironies, I think, is that, you talked about Bannon's worldview, and he does have, in my estimation, a pretty scary vision for how Trump could have made fascism much more palatable to the general electorate.
Yeah.
Where if he could have just followed Bannon's playbook and given, middle class and working class voters a little piece of the pie with the last tax bill, and maybe, not gone all in on AI and crypto and data centers, which are wildly unpopular with his base, done more of that economic populism combined with the absolute brutalist ICE regime, I don't think Trump's numbers would be where they were, and maybe he wouldn't have to try and steal this election quite as hard.
You're so right. He has really been connected to the zeitgeist in that way, more than any other right-wing figure, maybe Tucker a little bit. And in particular, what he's pushed on these populist positions, and that's why he's warned about Mamdani and others. It's not just the sort of the generic ideology stuff. It's specifically on these economic fights. His point is that they don't have an answer to that yet. And that's why he's been sort of anti-Vance, and because he understands how much AI and these sort of tech people are hated, and how uncomfortable he is with their power. And his populism is grounded in something that is designed to make authoritarianism a lot more palatable and popular.
Right.
And that is scary.
Fun on time, the traditional way. Yeah. So, I mean, he's definitely a figure to keep an eye on, and you do such invaluable reporting on people like Steve Bannon, for those of us who cannot stomach to watch him for more than a couple minutes at a time. I know we're all keeping an eye on Todd Blanche's confirmation hearings that are going on right now in the Senate. And this is an issue that I know your team has been working on. We've seen the Department of Justice tarnished and broken under Pam Bondi. Now with Todd Blanche, who looks like he is going to be confirmed. He is Trump's personal lawyer. He has led the stonewalling on the Epstein files. He really, in the words of Matt Gertz, from Media Matters, he really considers the president to be the client of DOJ, not the country. How much damage could Attorney General Todd Blanche do beyond what has already been done?
A lot. We've barely seen the beginning of it, because one of the things that, and it sort of ties in with a lot of the election stuff we were talking about, is that he's an effective right-wing media advocate and creature. He really got a lot. His profile greatly improved and increased in Trump's orbit the more he did right-wing media programming. There is not a nonsensical conspiracy that Hannity has not pushed, or a line of attack or a theory that Blanche has not been willing to take up the mantle of in some way, shape, or form. He doesn't say no. He operationalizes and institutes and implements, as we saw with that slush fund. Effectively, I mean, that was wild, right? And because he doesn't say no, and he'll continue to push it, and he doesn't give. He doesn't yield in any way, even though that's effectively shut down. They won't document it. They won't confirm that it is, right? So even the littlest thing. So that to me feels important. I think the other thing is, and this is where the willingness to spray, and I think this is where the escalation goes, is that we've seen that he's been willing to leverage power, DOJ power, not just for investigations and subpoenas, but for indictments. And even if they're likely to fail, he doesn't care. He'll keep doing it. And one of the things that's been percolating, much like these election attacks, is a wave of indictments against and subpoenas against other prominent political figures. They've been thinking about going after the Obamas, and we're already seeing this right now with John Brennan. There will be a wave of those on the horizon as this gets confirmed, and they will use forum selection provisions that they have at their disposal to push those people into jurisdictions and courts where they're likely to get some more traction, like in, say, Florida, for instance. And I think that's what's on the horizon, is that whatever degree of venom and vengeance that you see displayed so far, this is nothing. This is just the previews, because he's not officially in power yet, and he's been holding back because and so much of the things that are percolating now, he will implement and execute the moment that he gets confirmed. And so the damage will be significant. The process is the punishment. And this is where the tie-in is, as we have to think about girding ourselves as a society, as members of society. They will continue to not just come at it from a policy perspective with this election attacks and others, but simultaneously they will be chipping away at the players, the participants that are trying, the bulwarks of our democracy, by using these types of vengeful, politically motivated prosecutions and DOJ attacks in order to not just shut them down, but dissuade others from standing up as well. And Todd Blanche will be an instrument of that.
I think we have a little footage from his hearing today.
Are you and President Trump friends?
I'm his lawyer, was his lawyer, and now I'm the Deputy Attorney General. So I met him as his criminal defense attorney. I'm not sure there's very many people who have ever had a criminal defense attorney who calls that person their friend. I now have a...
Well, let me put it this way. Are you enemies?
No, we're not enemies at all. No.
Have you...
That was a Freudian slip.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
I think it's what he believes. I mean, it's with Trump, because there's no durability in his relationships, it's purely based off of your last act of fidelity. Somebody in a position like Todd Blanche will always have to do the most extreme thing in order to maintain that perch. And that, to me, is the real scary part about this, is his relationship, his connection to the fever swamps. That's illustrative. But the mechanism for how that power will be utilized is the fact that he's now fully internalized this cycle of fidelity to Trump.
Well, Angelo, can you tell us anything about some of the stories that your team is working on right now that we should be on the lookout for?
I think the biggest thing that we're really focusing in on is how obviously we know what the two lines of attacks are going to be. It's going to be that China interfered and Venezuela. And I think the thing that we're zeroed in, at least right now, one big part of it, is they haven't settled on a story. Every story needs one good bad guy, right? And they've broken the basic rule.
You have been in custody. So.
That's it. They just can't figure it out. And even with all this, the fact is they still haven't settled on which bad guy they want to pin this on. And from our perspective, that's revealing, because one of the things that's defined MAGA storytelling coalition over the last year or so has been all the fragmentation, all the infighting. And the fact that they're starting from a perspective of it's not very clear who the villain is revealing. And so we're really right now focusing on not just the mechanics of who's been pushing that, what that tells us about where they're going next, but then more importantly, what does that mean for the potential uplift here? And we'll be digging in just like we have been all along.
Great. Angelo, can you tell us the best way that people can find Media Matters work online?
You'll find us at MediaMatters.org.
Great. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing all of the work that you're doing. It's so important.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.